The year is 1715. The Palace of Versailles stands in all its glory, bathed in the golden light of the morning sun. The gardens stretch as far as the eye can see, symmetrical, perfect, like a vision from a dream. Fountains dance with crystal water, statues of gods and kings cast long shadows across the pathways. Servants whisper as they hurry along the marble corridors. The scent of roses lingers in the air, but so does something else, something darker. Inside the gilded walls of the palace, behind the silk curtains and golden furniture, a man lies dying. His face, once proud and commanding, is now pale and gaunt. His breath is shallow, each inhale a struggle. His body is racked with pain, rotting from within. Gangrene has claimed his leg, and death is closing in. But his eyes, they still burn. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who ruled France for 72 years. He is the longest reigning monarch in European history. A king who made himself the very symbol of absolute power. For over 7 decades, his word was law. He bent the nobility to his will, defied his enemies in battle, and transformed France into the most powerful kingdom in Europe. But the glory came at a price. His wars drained the treasury. His palaces consumed fortunes. His people suffered under the weight of taxes and hunger. And now, as he faces his final moments, the future of his kingdom is uncertain. Louis XIV had built an empire of gold and marble, but beneath the surface lay cracks that would one day swallow his dynasty whole. How did a young boy, scarred by rebellion and fear, rise to become the most powerful king in Europe? How did he turn his reign into a golden age of culture, art and power, while planting the seeds of a revolution that would bring the monarchy to its knees? And what was the true cost of his pursuit of glory? The price paid by his people, his family, and even himself. To understand the Sun King, we must go back to the beginning. To a time when Louis was not yet a god, but a child, hunted, afraid, and powerless. Because before he built Versailles, before he wore the crown with divine authority, Louis XIV was just a boy who would watch his enemies storm the gates of his home and swear that one day, no one would ever defy him again. This is the story of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who built France's golden age and in doing so, sealed its fate. Louis XIV's journey to power began not in splendor, but in fear. Born on September 5, 1638, at the royal chateau in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, he was the long-awaited heir to the French throne. His parents, King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria, had struggled for over 20 years to produce an heir. For decades, the royal marriage had been cold, distant, marked by political tensions and personal indifference. The arrival of Louis d'Eudon, Louis the God-given, was seen as a divine gift, a miracle sent by heaven to secure the future of France. Church bells rang out across the kingdom, and the people rejoiced. But the boy who would one day call himself the Sun King was born into a kingdom on the verge of chaos. France in the early 17th century was a kingdom divided and unstable. For decades, the country had been torn apart by religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, Huguenots, as they were known in France. Though the Edict of Nantes, signed in 1598, had brought an uneasy peace, the scars of conflict still ran deep. The nobility, the great families of France, held enormous power. These lords controlled vast estates like miniature kingdoms, with private armies and the loyalty of thousands of peasants. Many of them saw the monarchy as little more than a rival, not a master. And the king himself? Louis XIII was a cautious and often distant ruler, heavily influenced by his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, a man feared as much as he was respected. Richelieu's goal was to strengthen the monarchy by weakening the power of the nobles and the Huguenots. He waged wars abroad and crushed dissent at home. But his methods bred resentment that would explode after his death. When Louis XIII died in 1643, Louis XIV was just 4 years old. The crown passed to this fragile child, but power did not. The real ruler of France was his mother, Queen Anne, who acted as regent, and her trusted advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor. Together, Anne and Mazarin sought to continue Richelieu's work, tightening the monarchy's grip on power. But the nobility had grown restless. The boy king was not feared. His mother was a foreigner, Austrian, distrusted. And Mazarin was seen as a greedy outsider, an Italian who drained the kingdom's wealth to fund endless wars. Whispers of rebellion began to spread. And soon, those whispers became shouts. Because before Louis could ever wear the crown as the Sun King, he would first have to survive the darkest chapter of his life, a rebellion that would nearly tear France apart. It was called the Fronde. And it would haunt him forever. The Fronde. A name that would come to define Louis XIV's childhood, and shape his vision of power for the rest of his life. The year was 1648. The 30 Years' War still raged across Europe, and France was stretched thin, financially drained, its armies scattered. Cardinal Mazarin, desperate for funds to maintain France's power, imposed new taxes on the nobles and the Parliament of Paris. But this time, the nobles refused to bow. They rallied their forces, leading the people of Paris into open revolt. It began as a demand for rights, but quickly became something far more dangerous, a fight for control over the kingdom. The streets of Paris became battlegrounds. Barricades were built. Royal officials were attacked. Palaces were besieged. And in the midst of this chaos was Louis, just 10 years old, watching as his kingdom seemed to crumble around him. One night, as the mob pressed against the gates of the royal palace, the young king was woken from his sleep. His mother held his hand, her face pale but determined. They fled the palace under cover of darkness, slipping past the angry crowds, escaping Paris like criminals. Louis hid in cold, unfamiliar rooms in distant fortresses, listening to the sounds of rebellion in the distance, hearing his name shouted by men who wanted him dead. The boy who was supposed to rule by divine right was now a fugitive, powerless, frightened. For years, the Fronde dragged on. Alliances shifted. Betrayals were common. Noble families fought not just against the crown, but against each other, turning France into a chaotic chessboard. Mazarin fought back with cunning and gold, bribing enemies, turning rivals into allies. But Louis saw it all, the deception, the bloodshed, the fragile nature of power. He learned that trust was dangerous. That mercy was weakness. Most importantly, he learned that no king was truly safe. By 1653, Mazarin had crushed the rebels, but the damage was done. Louis XIV had been scarred. The memory of fleeing his own palace, of hiding in fear, would stay with him for the rest of his life. And he made a vow, never again. Never again would the nobility challenge the king. Never again would Paris rise against him. Never again would he be at the mercy of anyone. When Louis XIV finally took power as an adult, he ruled with this lesson etched into his soul. He would not share power. He would not compromise. He would be absolute. And he would make sure that everyone, noble, peasant and foreign king alike, knew that Louis XIV was not just a ruler. He was the state. And the state would bow to him. Louis XIV had survived the Fronde. He had seen the limits of power. He had seen the nobility defy the crown. He had seen the people rise in anger. He had felt what it was like to be vulnerable, to be a king without power. And he swore that it would never happen again. When Cardinal Mazarin died in 1661, Louis was 22 years old. For the first time, he stood alone at the head of the French state. Everyone in court expected him to appoint a new chief minister, another figure to govern in his name. But Louis shocked them all. He summoned his ministers, his generals and his advisers, and with calm confidence, he spoke the words that would define his reign. L'état c'est moi. I am the state. Louis declared that he would rule alone, an absolute monarch. There would be no more powerful advisers pulling strings behind the throne. Every decision, every law, every war, every tax, would come from him. The nobles who had once challenged his family, now stood before him, silent, obedient. The boy who had fled the mobs of Paris had become the master of France. But Louis knew that words were not enough. Power must be seen. It must be felt. It must surround you like the sun itself, blinding anyone who dared to look directly at it. Louis began crafting his kingdom in his image. His first target was the nobility, the very families who had humiliated him during the Fronde. Louis did not banish them. He did not execute them. He made them come to him. He summoned the great lords of France to his court, and he built the stage upon which they would all dance. A palace unlike any the world had ever seen. A place of beauty and excess, where power would be draped in gold and silk. Its name would echo through history, Versailles. Construction began in earnest in 1661. Thousands of workers dug into the marshland, drained the swamps, laid stone upon stone. Fortunes were spent, entire villages uprooted. Architects, gardeners, and artists were summoned from across Europe. The palace rose like a vision, a marvel of French art and ambition. Golden halls, mirrored galleries, endless gardens. A symbol of the king's glory and his control. When it was complete, Louis moved his entire court to Versailles. The nobles, those who had once held armies, were reduced to courtiers. They danced at his balls, whispered in his halls, and begged for his favor. The days of rebellion were over. The nobility had not been destroyed, they had been domesticated. And Louis stood above them all, the Sun King. But power over the nobility was not enough. Louis wanted more. He wanted glory. He wanted France to dominate Europe. And so, he turned to war. The first target was his neighbor Spain. Spain was weakened, its king dying without a strong heir. Louis claimed parts of the Spanish Netherlands, arguing that they belonged to his wife Maria Theresa, daughter of the Spanish king. In 1667, French troops crossed the border. The War of Devolution had begun. French armies swept across Flanders, capturing towns with ease. Louis was victorious, but Europe was watching. The Dutch, the English, and the Holy Roman Empire feared French power. They forced Louis to halt his advance. He gained land, but not the dominance he craved. But Louis was patient. He strengthened his army, expanded his fortresses, and prepared for his next move. Because for Louis XIV, war was not just politics, it was personal. It was the ultimate display of his power, the extension of his will. If he was the state, then the state would march forward, under his son, conquering everything in its path. Louis XIV had tasted victory, but he wanted more. He set his sights on the Dutch Republic, an economic powerhouse, wealthy but vulnerable. Louis saw their wealth, their ports, their trade, everything he believed should belong to France. In 1672, he launched his greatest campaign, the Franco-Dutch War. The French army, modern, disciplined, and vast, marched into the Netherlands. Fortresses fell before them. Towns surrendered. But the Dutch would not break so easily. They opened their dikes, flooding their fields, turning the land into a sea, stopping the French advance. And Europe reacted. The Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Brandenburg Prussia joined the Dutch. Suddenly, Louis faced a coalition of powers, battling on all sides. The war dragged on for 6 years. Thousands of soldiers died in muddy fields and frozen forests. Louis gained territory, but the cost was high. France's enemies had united. The balance of power in Europe had shifted. And Louis was beginning to see that glory was not cheap. But victory, in his eyes, was still worth any price. Back in France, his court continued to glitter. Masked balls, lavish feasts, fountains spraying water into the sky. But beneath the gold, cracks were forming. The taxes to fund Louis's wars were crushing the peasants. Famine spread in the countryside, villages burned, fields abandoned. But Louis could not see it. From Versailles, everything seemed perfect. The nobles bowed, the palace shone, and his armies marched. He was the Sun King, the center of everything. But like the sun, his power burned hot, scorching those beneath him. And the longer he reigned, the more the shadows grew. Louis was not done. There would be more wars, more victories, more suffering. But for now, he stood at the height of his power. A king like no other. A god on earth. But gods often forget, they too can fall. By the final years of the 17th century, Louis XIV was no longer just a king. He was an empire unto himself. France was the most powerful state in Europe. Its armies were the largest, its culture the most admired, and its wealth seemed boundless, at least from the windows of Versailles. But Louis's hunger for glory had not faded. If anything, it had grown. Because beyond the borders of France, an opportunity was rising. An opportunity that could give Louis what he had always dreamed of, complete dominance over Europe. In 1700, King Charles II of Spain died. He was childless, weak, and his kingdom was crumbling from within. But his empire, Spain and its vast colonies, stretched across Europe and the Americas. Whoever claimed his throne would not just rule Spain. They would command a global empire. And Louis saw his chance. Charles II had named Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, as his heir. If Philip took the Spanish throne, the crowns of France and Spain could be united. It would make the Bourbon dynasty the most powerful force the world had ever seen. But Europe would not allow it. The balance of power was at stake. If France and Spain became one, no kingdom would be safe. And so war came, one last great war, the War of the Spanish Succession. It began in 1701, a conflict that would stretch across Europe and beyond. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and the Holy Roman Empire formed the Grand Alliance, determined to stop Louis. Battles raged from the fields of Flanders to the hills of Italy. French armies fought bravely, but the strain was unbearable. The war dragged on for over a decade. Tens of thousands of soldiers died, on both sides. Entire villages were razed to the ground. Famine gripped France. The peasants starved while the nobles danced at Versailles. The illusion of glory was fading. Louis was no longer invincible. His generals suffered defeats. His enemies grew stronger. And the people who had once cheered him as the Sun King, now whispered in the shadows. Whispered of hunger. Whispered of suffering. Whispered of hate. For the first time, Louis felt the weight of his choices. Victory no longer seemed certain. But Louis was not a man to surrender. He clung to his vision, fighting not for land or power, but for his legacy. Because in his mind, he was not just a king, he was France. And France did not kneel. The war dragged on into the early 1710s. France was bleeding, its economy shattered, its people exhausted. But Louis pressed on, because for him, the crown was not just power, it was survival. If he lost, everything he had built, Versailles, his armies, his legacy, could be swept away. The Allied forces, led by the Duke of Marlborough, won a series of crushing victories. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704. The Battle of Ramillies in 1706. The Battle of Oudenarde in 1708. Each defeat chipped away at the image of Louis as the untouchable Sun King. His enemies pushed deep into France. Paris itself seemed within reach. And the people suffered most. Farms were burned. Crops failed. Bread became a luxury. Hunger turned to despair. Mothers buried their children. Fathers watched their fields wither. And the name Louis XIV, once spoken with awe, was now cursed in the streets. But Louis did not break. At the age of 70, racked with illness, weakened by grief, he still ruled. Because for Louis, there was no alternative. To lose was to die. To surrender was to erase everything. And then finally, after over a decade of suffering, a fragile peace was found. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. Philip, Louis's grandson, was allowed to keep the Spanish throne. But France would never unite with Spain. Louis had won, partially. But the cost was devastating. His armies were drained. His treasury was empty. His people were broken. And his vision, his dream of France as the unrivaled power of Europe, had slipped through his fingers. Louis returned to Versailles, not as the conquering Sun King, but as an old man. He walked the same gilded halls, but they felt different now. The music was quieter. The laughter was thinner. The gold seemed less bright. Because Louis knew what few dared say aloud, his reign was ending. He had ruled for over 70 years, longer than any king in European history. But the weight of that crown had taken everything from him. His queen was dead. His son was dead. His grandsons were dead. The only heir left was his great-grandson, Louis XV, a fragile child. A boy who had not seen the wars, who had not felt the fire of rebellion, who did not know the cost of power. Louis stood at the height of his power, but he was alone. And deep down, he feared that everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for, could one day be washed away. Because he had ruled as a god, untouchable, glorious, absolute. But the people he had overlooked, taxed and starved, they had not forgotten. And in their hearts, resentment was growing, like a seed in the dark. A seed that would bloom into revolution. But Louis would not live to see that. For now, he was still the Sun King. And the sun, though setting, still shone over Versailles. Louis XIV had won his final war, but the man who had stood at the height of European power now stood at the edge of death. His kingdom had endured his wars, his court had danced beneath his chandeliers, and his name had echoed through palaces and battlefields alike. But as the Sun King gazed out from the windows of Versailles in the final years of his life, he began to see what few monarchs ever dare to admit: even the brightest sun must set. He was no longer the invincible ruler of his youth. His once proud posture had stooped, his face etched with lines of suffering. Decades of stress, grief, and disease had weakened his body. But the real pain was deeper. Because power had cost him everything he loved. His beloved wife, Maria Theresa, had died in 1683, after years of enduring his affairs and his neglect. But it was the death of his children and grandchildren that broke him. In 1711, his eldest son, the Grand Dauphin, died of smallpox. Just a year later, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, along with his wife and their child, died in a wave of measles. One by one, his heirs perished, leaving only a frail, sickly great-grandson, Louis XV, as his successor. The line he had fought so hard to protect, the future of his dynasty, now rested on a fragile child. Louis XIV had built his kingdom to last forever, but as he stood in the Hall of Mirrors, surrounded by gold and glass, he could see the cracks. He had silenced the nobility, but he had not earned their loyalty. They had bent, but they had not forgotten. He had crushed the common people under taxes to fund his wars, but he had not won their love. They whispered curses in the fields he had never seen. He had crushed the common people under taxes to fund his wars, but he had not won their love. They whispered curses in the fields he had never seen. He had raised Versailles as a temple to his glory, but its foundations were not stone, they were bones. Bones of peasants who had died building it. Bones of soldiers who had fallen for his conquests. Bones of a family he had buried one by one. And now he felt it, the cold hand of mortality creeping over him. The man who had once believed himself the Sun King, immortal, divine, was now just a man. And he realized that power, for all its gold and splendor, could not defeat time. The crown was eternal. The king was not. On August 10, 1715, Louis XIV fell ill. At first, his court believed it was just another brief sickness. The king had endured so much before. But the infection in his leg, gangrene, spread rapidly. Doctors tried their crude remedies, bleeding, leeches, prayers, but nothing could stop the rot. The Sun King was dying. And as he lay in his bed, surrounded by his courtiers, his final thoughts were not of battles or palaces, they were of regret. He called for his great-grandson, the future Louis XV, a boy of just 5 years old. He held the child's hand, his voice weak but clear, and spoke the words that would echo through history. Do not follow my example. Try to remain at peace with your neighbors. Avoid wars, they ruin the people. It was an admission that few rulers ever make, a recognition that his pursuit of glory had come at too great a cost. On September 1, 1715, after ruling for 72 years, Louis XIV, the Sun King, died. His death was met with mourning at court, but with relief in the streets. For the common people of France, his reign had been a time of suffering, war, famine, and taxes that crushed their spirits. As his body was carried to the royal basilica of Saint Denis, crowds gathered, not to honor him, but to jeer. The man who had believed himself a god was now nothing more than a corpse. But his legacy, his vision of France, would endure. Versailles would remain a symbol of power and beauty. French culture, art, and influence would shape Europe for generations. But the seeds of revolution had also been planted. Because while Louis had built an empire of gold, he had built it on suffering. And when his great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, stood on the same throne decades later, it would not be nobles who bent the knee, it would be revolutionaries holding ropes and guillotines. The palaces would burn. The monarchy would fall. The people, those he had overlooked, would rise. Louis XIV had built his kingdom to stand forever. But he had also laid the foundation for its destruction. Because absolute power, no matter how bright, always casts a shadow. And when the sun finally set on the House of Bourbon, the shadow would consume it. Louis XIV was gone. The Sun King, who had ruled for 72 years, had taken his final breath. The man who had once declared, "I am the state," was now nothing more than dust, laid to rest in the royal crypt at Saint Denis, among the kings of France. But his death was not the end. The kingdom he left behind, shaped by his vision, his wars, his splendor, would carry his mark for centuries. Some saw him as the greatest monarch in French history. Others saw him as the man who led his country toward ruin. Both were right. France, under Louis XIV, had reached the height of its power. His armies had marched across Europe. His navy had challenged the fleets of England. French culture became the envy of the world. Fashion, art, music, architecture, all carried the stamp of Versailles. The French language became the language of diplomacy, the language of kings and queens across Europe. And Versailles, the palace that Louis built, stood as the beating heart of this power. A place where every hallway whispered his name. Where every fountain danced in his honor. But beneath this grandeur, beneath the gold, the mirrors, the marble, was something far more fragile. Debt. Suffering. Resentment. Louis XIV had spent fortunes on his wars and his palaces, draining the treasury to project his image of power. He had raised taxes to fill the void, but those taxes did not touch the nobles or the court. It was the peasants, the farmers, the laborers, the families in the fields, who carried that burden. Year after year, they paid the price for Louis's glory. And though they bowed their heads in his time, their pain would not be forgotten. The Sun King had tamed the nobility. He had charmed the court. But he had ignored the people. And the people had long memories. In the decades that followed his death, his great-grandson, Louis XV, would inherit a kingdom that still shimmered on the surface but was crumbling underneath. The taxes increased. The bread grew scarce. The nobility danced while the commoners starved. And in the shadows, whispers turned to anger. Louis XIV's reign was not the end of French power. But it was the beginning of a countdown, one that would end in blood. Because the system he built, absolute power held by a king, supported by a court of nobles, resting on the backs of the poor, was not built to last forever. And when it fell, it would fall hard. But for now, in the years after his death, his legacy still burned bright. Europe had seen his power. The world had heard his name. And the Sun King still ruled, if not in body, then in memory. The legacy of Louis XIV stretched far beyond France. His reign changed Europe, forever. He had made France the dominant power on the continent. His wars had redrawn borders, weakened his rivals, and inspired fear across kingdoms. But more than that, Louis XIV had changed what it meant to be a king. He had elevated monarchy to something divine, something absolute. Kings across Europe looked to him as a model. Peter the Great in Russia studied Louis's court, his army, his navy, taking inspiration to modernize his own empire. Frederick the Great of Prussia saw Louis's discipline and strength as the standard for his own kingdom. Even in Britain, where the power of kings was increasingly limited, Louis XIV's grandeur forced English monarchs to justify their own strength. The idea of the Sun King, the ruler who was the state, became the image that monarchs chased for generations. But the lesson Louis left was not just for kings, it was for all who wield power. That absolute control comes with a cost. That glory built on suffering will not last. Because no matter how bright the sun burns, it always sets. In 1789, just 74 years after Louis XIV's death, the storm finally came. The people rose up. The nobility, once so proud at Versailles, now fled for their lives. And Louis XVI, the great-great-grandson of the Sun King, was dragged before the crowd. No palace could protect him now. No court rituals could shield him. He stood on a wooden platform, beneath a gray sky, staring at the guillotine. The blade fell. The monarchy Louis XIV had built, shattered. But the palace of Versailles still stood. And it stands to this day. A monument to the Sun King's vision, his glory, his excess, his power. A reminder of what he achieved, and what he destroyed. Because Louis XIV was more than a king. He was a symbol of what rulers can build when they hold nothing back. And of the price that is always paid by someone when they do. Louis XIV was gone. The Sun King's light had faded, but his shadow stretched across centuries. His reign had transformed France into the most powerful kingdom in Europe. His palace at Versailles stood as a symbol of wealth, elegance, and control. His wars had reshaped borders, and his vision of absolute monarchy had influenced rulers across the world. But his legacy was not only one of glory. It was also a legacy of suffering. The peasants who had labored under his taxes. The soldiers who had died in his wars. The families who had starved while he built fountains and mirrored halls. Louis XIV's dream had built an empire, but it had also planted the seeds of revolution. And when those seeds finally bloomed, they would consume the very monarchy he had worked so hard to strengthen. So we ask you, was Louis XIV a visionary? Did he secure France's place as the cultural and political leader of Europe? Or was he a tyrant, driven by ego, blind to the suffering of his people, and ultimately responsible for the fall of his dynasty? History remembers him as both. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. Because power, true power, always demands a price. The only question is, who pays it? If you found the story of Louis XIV, the Sun King, fascinating, his reign is only one part of France's long journey through power and revolution. The century after his death would see his descendants struggle to hold onto the crown he had built. Until, finally, it all came crashing down in 1789, the French Revolution. The halls of Versailles would echo with the cries of the people. The king's crown would be replaced with a blade, the guillotine. But even then, from the ashes, a new ruler would rise. A man who would claim more power than even Louis XIV had dared to dream. His name, Napoleon Bonaparte. If you think Louis XIV's reign was extraordinary, wait until you hear how Napoleon reshaped not just France, but the entire world. Click here to watch our full documentary on Napoleon, the emperor who conquered Europe. And don't forget, subscribe to our channel for more stories of power, ambition, and the people who shaped history. Because the past is not dead. It lives with us. And the kings of yesterday still shape the world we live in today.